The key thing is what one thinks consciousness is. So we think about consciousness very specifically about disorders of consciousness, including in hallucinations and schizophrenia, like we studied, when people are conscious of something that's not actually there in the outside world, that the brain manufactures its own conscious percept, and in the case of schizophrenia, believes it, etc.
So when you think of a consciousness, you say, well, gee, my sense of myself is I made this decision. And so there's another level of awareness that who I am that is not shaped by the brain per se.
Everyone's talking about consciousness, but the amazing thing is all the things we can do unconsciously. Sometimes we can even get to the point of decision making and action, and only post hoc our brain fills in, and our brain is a very good filler inner, or even can create memories, confabulate our false memories. We are storytelling animals, and our brain tells a story and makes sense of things. At the core of it is representation, and how we represent or map the world, and then how we go from attention to intention.
Hello, I'm John Clippinger, your host for First Principles First podcast. And we're delighted to have as our guest Professor David Silbersweig, who was a former academic dean at the Harvard Medical School and chairman emeritus of the Department of Psychiatry, and currently a co-director of the Institute for Neuroscience. What we'd like to do in this episode is to explore some of the general themes that we've discussed in our prior episodes, particularly sort of what are the foundations for what we consider to be intelligence. Because part of the theme that we're trying to explore in this series of podcasts is what is the nature of intelligence? What is the nature of consciousness? What is the underlying science? What are the first principles that we can start to think about when we start to design new kinds of synthetic intelligence? Is there a grounding and fundamental principles from physics to neuroscience to biology? And can we have a really principled ways of thinking about these things in developing an architectures for our next generation of artificial intelligent agents and networks? And so what I'd like to do is begin with our guest and ask him, from his background, give a little background on it, what his research has been, what his career interests are, and also what he considered to be some of his most challenging tasks or most challenging research interests, and what he would like to see as a next generation exploration of the nature of intelligence, where that takes us. And given David's background, and he can give us a little more detail, as not only a research scientist, but also a practicing psychiatrist, what might be a new direction in clinical practice that will come out of these understanding the nature of intelligence, the nature of intelligence that relates to life, new foundational concepts as to in neuroscience, but also in the treatment of neurological or psychological or cognitive disorders, not only in the individual, but on the collective basis. So David, welcome aboard.
Thank you, John. What a pleasure to speak with you as always about these fascinating topics and issues. So to your question, I'm a psychiatrist and a neurologist. I trained in both fields because I was interested really in having a full understanding across the spectrum of the mind and the brain. And I'm also a behavioral neuroscientist. I use functional neuroimaging, brain imaging, in order to interrogate the nervous system non-invasively in humans and predominantly in adults with and without disorders, the healthy brain mind, if you will, and the unhealthy brain mind. And I studied philosophy before medicine and always really was fascinated by philosophy of mind and some of the core issues that you allude to, and really have seen or taken my journey academically as an attempt to contribute to the thinking in these areas to try to address these questions of what's the nature of mind, the human mind, and how our increasing understanding of the brain can impact that and can impact, hopefully, or inform our approaches to some of the problems that we have, both individually and collectively.
So part of your career was doing research in neuroscience and neuroimaging, and I understand correctly that you also made cross paths with Carl Friston, who we've interviewed on this group, and he had also worked with Jerry Adelman, and who I knew very briefly and met and discussed some of these things many years ago. And I would be interested in your journey in terms of looking at neuroimaging and going into the research is what were you looking for? Sort of what did you find? And then what did you, as the things that you discovered, how did that sort of change your thinking? And what kinds of new paradigms? So, I mean, one of the things that we're exploring on this podcast is the emergence of new paradigms and understanding mind, matter, and life. And that we have been thinking about things in a particular mode. It's basically a reductionist, materialist way of thinking about things, which constitutes certain perspective in science. But I think part of the explorations we're having in these podcasts is saying, well, there may be other perspectives in certain terms of understanding the informational character of consciousness or informational intelligence, and that there is a shift in thinking. And I think Carl has, I think, led a lot of the thinking in that direction when he talks about this notion of active inference, and to the predictive brain thesis, and to be alive is to be make predictions. So there's this tying together of biology and science in a way that's very different, say, than the traditional AI way of talking about things. Comes from engineering, it's a machine. We think, intelligence is associated with being able to perform certain tasks very fast, and that smart people do certain kind of tasks. So this super intelligence may be out there. But when you take a biological neuroscience perspective and actually tie it in back, grounded into certain principles of physics, you get a certain different perspective on what intelligence is, what is a healthy mind, a healthy brain, and whether it's just confined to the skull or it's outside the skull. This kind of all the things that all little boxes that we were taught to put things in don't seem to work anymore. And you've been right at the forefront of that, both as a researcher and a practitioner and an organizer of a whole sort of research effort. So give us your thoughts on that.
I love the way you sort of put things together, and in fact, that's the pond or the ocean that I've been swimming in, right? And and it does take me back to my philosophy days. My honors thesis was in philosophy of mind and had to do with functionalism, and actually addressing or arguing against or critiquing some of Jerry Fodor's notions of functionalism and reductionism, and how, whether a mind needs to be instantiated in a brain or not, and also whether you can reduce psychology to neurobiology or not. And so these are the fundamental questions, as you are saying, John, and that I've been wrestling with for a long time. And as you say, Carl and others have made brilliant contributions to. My own work, experimentally and empirically, and together with Emily Stern, my partner scientifically, and is that it has had and has two main foci. One is methodologic development of the field of functional brain imaging, first with PET imaging, positron emission tomography, and then with functional MRI, in order to improve the methods to answer questions that couldn't hitherto be asked about the human mind, brain, in health and disease. And so we've had in our lab a whole constant thread of methods development, and we now have a spin-out company related to some of this work and potential translational applications. I won't be talking about anything conflictual in this podcast about that. So there's the methodologic side in order to be able to look more precisely and to characterize these brain circuits, to pick up the signal, to refine it, to be able to pull out the information with advanced analytics now, including ML and AI. and understand the neural circuitry underlying perception, cognition, emotion, and behavior in health and disease in humans. So, and then the second big overarching theme, if you will, of the work over the years has been to not just focus on one disorder or one thing. We've always been interested in the whole big picture. How does the whole Venn diagram piece together? Psychiatric disorders, for instance, are defined still descriptively and categorically, and that's not how they occur in nature. And that's not necessarily the underlying biological reality. And so instead of focusing on just one disorder, for instance, we took a very symptom-oriented approach, and we're very involved in developing the field of symptom-specific brain imaging in neuropsychiatric disorders that cross all disorders and try to understand the neural circuitry underlying or the final common pathways of clinical expression of disorders of perception, cognition, emotion, and behavior and consciousness, and to do that in a way that would allow us to identify the nodes, the brain areas, and the circuits and the abnormal connections among the brain regions within the network that produce things like hallucinations in schizophrenia, anhedonia in depression, the lack of interest or pleasure that people have, the emotional behavioral discontrol and borderline personality disorder, but more broadly, what could cause psychosis or mood dysregulation or emotional behavioral dysregulation across any disorder, including when it's, quote, neurologic as opposed to, quote, psychiatric, if it's caused by a brain tumor or epilepsy or a stroke, versus if it's caused by schizophrenia or bipolar disease, manic depressive illness, and trying to then transcend distinctions or dichotomies that were traditional between mind and brain, between neurology and psychiatry, and to be able to understand, carve nature at its joints, if you will, in a more data-driven as well as hypothesis-driven manner to identify the functions and the processes and localize them in the brain, including emergent ones that have to do with things like consciousness and awareness and disruptions thereof. And so in a way, our work over the years has been to try to piece together a new taxonomy, if you will, of neuropsychiatric disorders, to break down the old silos and to understand in health and disease how something can be part of the neural circuitry underlying normal mental function that's adaptive evolutionarily in our species, but how that circuitry can go awry in very specific ways and very specific places to produce neuropsychiatric symptoms that are incredibly destructive and that can cause suffering and dysfunction.
So when we talk about sort of disorders, I mean, and you can see, I'm not going to imagine there's like physiological disorders. There's something but what about sort of symbolic disorders, and that do they have a certain character to them that so when you take a holistic view of the person, it's not just the person is a simple biological entity or a physical, but also a person is a symbolic entity that interacts with the environment, has representations of the environment, and some of them are, I guess, adaptive or non-adaptive. I mean, one of our prior interviewees, Don Hoffman, makes the point that we've evolved a view of nature that is it's a sampling problem that we actually have. We're deceiving ourselves into an oversimplification of the world as we sample it, and that it's like he would say it's like a VR headgear that we have this sort of these icons that we manipulate, but that don't represent the world, and that we're sampling such a small space of what is real, that there's an inherent distortion that takes place. And so he was saying the idea of seeing objective reality is not, it's a constructed reality. And it's constructed partly by our physiology, I mean, and as a species. And I guess we may have a different view of the world than, say, other species. We see different things. We work at different frequencies, so they're adapted to different niches. And then as a culture, as a people, we create our own mental models, right? That have adaptive or not so adaptive values for us. So when you talk about the holistic model, and you talk about health, and then you're getting into going from description into a normative prescription in some sense. And that's a very fine line to walk, isn't it, right? Even on but I think it's a natural outgrowth of the integration of all these different fields. I mean, just as yourself as a philosopher says, suddenly you can't sort of avoid these things, right?
Yeah.
So,
So
what's your stance in that?
yeah, so there's a lot to unpack in what you said,
Yes.
and have a lot of thoughts about it, which is, and so that's terrific, John. A few different things to answer different aspects of your query. The first is, and I agree with you. The first is that we do have a sampling issue, and we are a species, and we transduce through our sense organs and our brains processing, etc. Now, one of the great things about our organ, the brain, is that we can develop other technology like microscopes and telescopes, or infrared, sensors, etc., to transduce things that we otherwise wouldn't, that are outside of our niche, if you will, or that give other information about our niche and transduce it into a manner that we then can process and make sense of and make use of. And that's one of the amazing things about the brain, of course. But of course, anything that we're talking about is through it's understood that it's limited in some important fashion. Now, in terms of the issue of reduction and so forth, we don't want to overly reduce and take away the symbolism or the psychology. And in fact, our work has been very involved with what is the neurobiology of symbolism. What are the neural underpinnings, or at least the neural correlates? And we have to distinguish between correlation and causation. It is very important to realize that the level at which we're interrogating the nervous system and the human mind is on the systems level. It's systems level neuroscience of large scale distributed networks in the brain, cortically and subcortically, and by that I mean it's not the cellular molecular level, where there's a lot of fantastic work going on, and it's incredibly important, and we always try to translationally link that with our level. Every level of science has limitations and strengths. One of the great strengths of the systems level neuroscience, and particularly functional neuroimaging or brain imaging, is that it's the level at which you can directly measure and correlate non-invasively brain states and mental states in humans in health and disease. And that's the tremendous power of it. And now, in doing that, one does not want to oversimplify. And in fact, and it's not totally reductionistic, and it's not totally unidirectional. In fact, one of the most interesting areas now in neuroscience is how experience-dependent learning, or experience for good or ill, trauma or abuse or enrichment, etc., education, can affect the brain, and vice versa. And so it's this iterative dance and feed forward and feedback that the brain engages in, with the body as the master organ of the body, overseeing and responding to the internal physiologic milieu of the body, as well as intersecting and interacting with the world and acting upon it and processing it, and then bringing those two together so that the bodily needs and states and the world changing context and situation can all be updated and appropriately modeled, including future models, and decisions can be made, and so forth. And so right now we're in an era where we are understanding how psychotherapy works, realizing that that acts on the brain and through the brain. And so there's no longer this dichotomy of the biological, the medications, the psychological, the brain stimulation treatments that we have now. And we're getting more and more specific about the neural underpinnings of even higher order things, and even social neuroscience and social interactions and group behaviors and cognitions, and how that all can connect in a way that allows us to view it sort of bi-directionally or even multi-directionally.
So to the point, I mean, so you're saying that our Cartesian dualism, mind-body dualism, is now sort of going away in practices, and so that which has been so strong before. But the other thing we're starting is seeing in the podcast and the sort of the neuroscience is this idea of the brain being at the locus of all consciousness. That it's like maybe it's more distributed through the body, and the brain, there's certain body functions and the chemical level thresholds and everything that affect the cognitive functioning, and that it's a much more complex interdependent system, and I think some recent work by Carl Friston, and I think Michael Levin, that says this idea of moral computation, in the sense that there's certain shapes and biological forms have some computational significance in what, and so it's not like there's just this little computer in the head that figures everything out. It's like, oh no, well, it is highly interconnected, and they're different states and the fluctuations that take place, and it's not just a cognitive function; it's precognitive or basal lower level functioning that affects the higher level functioning.
Absolutely. Yes, all of the above. It is important that the brain itself, within the neuroaxis or the functioning of the body, does have an orchestrating and a hierarchical, and in terms of processing power, really predominance for good reason. That said, and that is the seat of some of the highest order elements. That said, we have a nervous system that spreads throughout every organ of our body, and for instance, the gastrointestinal tract has a whole neural net that's profound and shares transmitters and peptides with the brain and so forth. We're understanding increasingly about how hormones interact bidirectionally with the brain and body, how the immune system does, certainly the autonomic nervous system, and so forth. And now it's really established that there is this continuous updating and information flow throughout. But that said, the brain is the sort of master computational organ, and it's very interesting to think about how that even happened evolutionarily. Evolutionarily, that's a separate discussion. But the brain, and then the other part of what you're asking or talking about, using the word consciousness, the key thing is what one thinks consciousness is, and the whole debate about definition of consciousness or consciousnesses, etc., and different things that are processed in or out of awareness at different levels within different modalities with different levels of integration, and different levels of access that we have as subjective agents, if you will, too. And so we think about consciousness very specifically, about disorders of consciousness, including in hallucinations and schizophrenia, like we studied, when people are conscious of something that's not actually there in the outside world, that the brain manufactures its own conscious percept, and in the case of schizophrenia, believes it, etc. Or patients with a persistent vegetative state or neurologic damage, brain damage, where consciousness is diminished or absent because the brain systems that subsume it, and they are complex and multi-level, and all the way from the brainstem to the subcortical to cortical and back. If one part of that is damaged in a certain way, you can get a certain kind of disorder or partial disorder of consciousness. So consciousness is not just one thing, and depending upon how one defines it, then that can get one out of the problem, although it's not. It's still a fascinating issue about whether the Earth as a whole, as a system, has consciousness, or the universe, and so forth. As long as we define what we're talking about, then we can talk about the issues of what we're meaning by these sorts of queries or statements or attempts to model these things, but they're not all the same.
To that point, I mean, so you have the thesis of the brain, so the fast, slow part of the brain, and that I think it's widely believed, we've shown that significant decisions are emotive in some. There's certain thresholds of resonance that lead to a change of opinion, after which there's a rationalization that takes place. So you say, well, why did you know? So you have a sense of self that's established as almost a resonance of complex states. Maybe we could just define it as a non-equilibrium stable state concept that Friston develops. So that results in the change, in a change of mind, a change of state, and then there's an explanation given afterwards. So you can have very strong worldviews that are very illogical, but they'll generate, and this is true of religions and folklore and science even. I mean, you sort of have a post hoc explanation of what is an emotional stance. So when you think of a consciousness, you say, well, gee, my sense of myself is I made this decision. Whereas well, I mean, if someone who admit I've taken some Ozempic and things like that, my appetite, my free will is like, oh, I'm not going to eat that. But you change the chemistry. I don't want it. I mean, I never even thought about it. It's like, and that's part of who myself is, so there's another level of decision making, of awareness that who I am that is not shaped by the brain per se. Is that
Well, it's shaped by the brain, but it's not amenable to conscious awareness by us subjectively. One might say, and so and you're bringing up profound points. The and gets into issues of neurophilosophy and so forth, having to do with free will. Does free will exist or not? What does it mean? Am I the who's in control? We're past the era of thinking that there's a homunculus or little man or woman inside, that's viewing the screen of the movie, so to speak, although that is our subjective sense, right? And so what's the neurobiology of that subjective sense? And then as you're saying as well, John, there's the issue of, decisions being made, information being processed, below the level of awareness. And that's not the same as, although it overlaps with sort of psychoanalytic notions of the unconscious. Here we're talking about really a neurobiological notion of automatic processing and preconscious, if you will, processing that includes emotional processing, very importantly, and where information from the outside world that's detected, and first of all, attention gets involved in this, and what we pay attention to, what captures our attention, what in a bottom-up way, what in a top-down way we allocate attention to, and what is below that threshold, and yet still processes important information offline, if you will, that's vital for us as an organism to survive. And in fact, some people have said that everyone's talking about consciousness, but the amazing thing is all the things we can do unconsciously, that are automatically done and that we can do offline without having to expend energy or effort or even awareness to do. Although, what is the threshold and what are the algorithms that govern whether something comes above the threshold of awareness? And then, as you're saying, sometimes we can even get to the point of decision making and action, and only post hoc our brain fills in, and our brain is a very good filler inner, or even can create memories, confabulate, or false memories. And so we are storytelling animals, and our brain tells a story and makes sense of things, if you will. And it gets into the whole issue of semantics and meaning and explanation, but certainly at the core of it is representation and how we represent or map the world and how we navigate it and how we also develop models of it and predictions of it, and then how we go from attention to intention, from what we would call afferent or on the perceptual sensory side to the efferent or the behavioral side, and then that loop bidirectionally, that it constantly, with feed forward and feed backward, helps us fine tune. And then the issue of also emergent properties and things that require a certain level of complexity within the neuroaxis in order to manifest. And so we have to take into account emergent processing and functions as well, and where a change in a quantitative state turns into a change in a qualitative state. And then the issue of scalelessness, or the degree to which any of these functions can be modeled as a complex system that you can scale down and look at microscopically, or you can scale up and look at in terms of societies or astrophysics in terms of complex systems theory.
So this gets to the whole notion of scale-free. I mean, the free energy principle, the scale-free and domain-free concept that sort of the Carl Friston and the active inference world contends. And actually, I think that Michael Levin sort of makes the point that at the cellular level, that even a cell has a sort of a sense of a consciousness, awareness of itself, and that they aggregate or organize at different levels. But and I think the way Chris Field puts it is, what is true above is also true below. In other words, there's a similar set of principles that are acting at all scales, and they create a different. They may come together to form a new kind of consciousness or a new kind of organizing principle, whatever you want to call it. But it's all nested, all highly interactive. So that raises a number of questions I have. Sort of like, well, how does there seems to be all this communication at multiple scales. There's some things that are contained, but then you're always sort of messaging. There must be an enormous amount of messaging and languages going on. That there's these languages that are being created that go throughout the body. There's this messaging is really essential, right?
Yeah, I think really, really interesting the points you're raising, John. I wouldn't use the word consciousness for things like that occur within a cell or a worm or something like that. However, on some level, as an organism, they or certain cells may have a representation of something, or may even, without a representation, respond in a stereotyped way, or in higher order things, less stereotyped and more flexible. That's one of the principles as you go up that scale, and as you go up that hierarchy evolutionarily, or so forth. And so when I'm thinking about consciousness, I'm talking about it in a cognitive sense, and I prefer to use other words. That said, I would still agree that on some important level, what's going on, although the product of it is different, and the result and the subjective state that it induces is different, that there are similar scaleless principles of organization of complex systems that are occurring, and that they may even be in the context, as you're saying, and Carl Friston, of the free energy principle and active inference, and minimization of uncertainty and so forth. But it gets back to some of the things I was wrestling with in my philosophy work, which was these different levels, that you have to understand things at all the levels. And you have to understand how the levels basically connect up with one another. But that doesn't mean that everything can be reduced to some permutation of the consequences of the level below it. There's certain things that are emergent, and that require another level, and then come into play and interact with the levels below and above it, so as to produce certain states that have certain characteristics.
I want to build on that point, because I think when if you can think of living things as being the different levels of communication, different language levels, representations being created. I mean, this gets into sort of Gödel and decidability of complex things, or being complete or incomplete, that you're evolving these complex representations that can compute something at a particular level. They have a particular register at that level, and that's never, it's like Wittgenstein's the fly in the bottle. It's never complete. You're always, but but it's necessary in order to manage that level of complexity. And I think that has a lot of implications when we talk about social pathologies and the levels of representation that we can get to in a minute. But the other thing that I wanted to allude to was that, and it came from my some research, and I think I may have mentioned this before, but I did in my thesis, was looking at, and this is in the dark ages of AI, but looking at texts and psychoanalytic texts that are highly transcribed. Every utterance was captured. Um, and it was clear that this woman, it was a woman patient, and she'd start to say something, and then something else would interrupt. And it came from a very different place. There was multiple interruptions that you say, well, this is not a uniform consciousness, a cognition creating this thing. It is actually multiple ones. And they work in synchrony or they don't, and they're not aware of it. And suddenly you would have one that's completely contradictory to another. And I got introduced, and I started developing this, and I got introduced to Jerry Edelman about this, and he was talking neurodarwinism. You say, so it actually makes sense. You spin up these different cells, and some of them can absorb some of the uncertainty. Some of them can they can specialize, and they synchronize. But it's like you're shining a light on different kinds of conscious. I talked to Dan Dennett early on when he was just starting in and said, yeah, it strikes me as that consciousness is sort of like that. I mean, is it not?
It is, and it's not, to the extent that I always want to come back and be exceedingly careful about how we use the term. And so I always want to define exactly the content of the representation and so on and so forth, because to your point, there are a whole bunch of different ones. And our brain is in a constantly dancing neurophysiologic state with multiple oscillators and
Right.
nodes that produce at different frequencies different resonances or oscillations together with different other permutations of other brain regions and nodes and circuits that are constantly shifting and that are orchestrated and interact with each other at different levels. And so that's what can give you the product of a certain computation that may or may not sync with the product of another computation, if you will,
Right.
but that all come together in a way that then, at the confluence of our subjective awareness and also our objective behaviors, and what regulates that, and how that can get disrupted, where the thresholds are, what the and at different levels you can have different explanations that have explanatory power at that level of the system, but not
That's
above
a really important point.
or
Well,
below it, and so you get to different levels of information as well.
let me throw another. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Tanya Luhrmann. She's a anthropologist at Stanford, and she studied people who have special friends, people who have conversations with God. She's lived with people who live with wizards, and the idea I think that she entertains is that, particularly in the case a special friend, simply a kid will invent a special friend, and it becomes an alternative ego they can bounce things off of. So it may be evolutionarily viable, or so to able not to be put all your eggs in one basket, as it were, and be able to distribute things, and sort of have these simulation models that you can work in and out of that have a reality, a phenomenological reality to them, um, and she would argue that it can be effective for people in how they manage their lives, irrespective of the rationality of the whole thing.
So you're getting now into some very important issues that I've been working and thinking a lot about lately too, and that gets to the issue of beliefs, and also this whole issue of, I would say mechanistically also we should be careful about what we attribute a benefit to in its final form, or see the result, or see the consequences of, as to whether it evolved for that purpose, or whether it, for certain things, it's epiphenomena, or just another outgrowth or result of a capacity that the brain mind evolved to do something else. And so, for instance, we have to be able to live, we're social animals, not just by ourselves. So
Right.
we have a whole neural apparatus, and social neuroscience is really rapidly developing now to be able to represent the intentions of other
Right.
agents and other people,
It's human
and to
mind.
infer their motivations, to have a sense or even some contagion around their emotions and so forth. So the ability to do this is very important for us to live as social animals and survive in our niches evolutionarily. But once you have that machinery, that can also be used to ascribe intentions to other things like teddy bears developmentally that can help and so forth. But then you're talking about wizards and other things that people believe. Then you get into some very, very interesting things. And then you can even get into things that are highly irrational or delusional or for which there's no evidence or even counter evidence. And then you get into other things like conspiracy theories. You know, why do 40% of Americans believe things that are demonstrably not true, even though they are not? Their brains, the majority of them are quote healthy, at least in the individual sense of not having a certain psychiatric disease, although they may have proclivities. And so it gets to the whole issue of what is normal and what is not normal. We don't want to over medicalize things. We have to be very careful. There are a lot of issues where that has been misused over the years, and so forth. But the whole issue of the, if not the bell shape, but certainly some distribution curve within any given set of representations or neural computations of Homo sapiens, of people, our structure function relationships are relatively homogeneous across people, but they also vary to a certain extent. But on a population level and individually, what's normative or not, or what's adaptive or not, and what's maladaptive or not, and what we call it, what we do about it. But the whole issue of beliefs and false beliefs or other things and the utility that they may have, or even post hoc, or the explanatory power or emotional psychological salve that they may provide, those are all distinct from the truth values or not of those propositions.
Just,
And
just,
yeah,
but still, okay. So we get into this idea of truth values and beliefs and the construction of beliefs and why people hold on to beliefs that are very irrational or seemingly counterproductive. But you can see, and this put it in a Bayesian framework, you may have prior beliefs that you learned within a social group that actually give you a sense of your identity, who you are, the continuity of that. They're highly functional within that very limited set, but they may be totally irrational with respect to any kind of objective function. And you may even have rational thoughts or beliefs that are very was contradictory in order to preserve the integrity of those social relations. And so this is the objective truth of the emotional. This is where I get into the emotional sense that you have a trade-off. You say, well, should I really believe in quantum mechanics and then I'll lose my family and and I don't know who I am. They all can think I'm a demon and I can't and all those things that give me to find who I am, I suddenly have to give up because of this abstract theorem that there's someone invented over here. I don't think so. I don't care what the math is. I'm going to stay here. So that what is the objective condition? You have a sort of a phenomenological objective condition, and that preserves that emotional state rather than a computational correctness.
yeah. So these, and we've talked a lot about this, you and I. These are very
Yeah.
profound sort of boundary cases or cases that really bring out some of the issues and problems. And you know, this is why people can vote against their own interests, if you will. On the other hand, it's not against their interests as far as their identity and their subgroup is concerned, or their sense of meaning and so forth. So you get into this is where you have to bring together the whole psychology or neuropsychology and what develops this and what's competing, if you will, for explanation, what wins out, what in a given person. And this is where, as we've talked about, a scientific approach, and I would also add a humanistic approach, is very important. Now, you could say, and people do, well, everything's relative, right? Including morality and everything else, or everything's culturally, relative or whatever. And this gets very intense, and there's a lot of discussions around this right now. And we absolutely should respect all different cultural beliefs and people's right to have them, etc. But that doesn't mean that everything's equally demonstrable or not. And certainly there's certain things that are not falsifiable. Those tend to be the things that people believe sometimes the most, in terms of things that you can't disprove, and maybe that's, and there's a reason for that. But the point is that that there is, for certain things, objective truth, ground truth, that can be obtained. There are other things that not. And then when you drill down on that ground truth, you realize it's not even ground truth, and you get into quantum theory and uncertainty principle and all of that, and that's absolutely fine, and that's true too. And even the things popping in and out of existence in 4 dimensions, etc. But at least within certain domains that can be modeled and studied, there are things that can be shown and not shown objectively. And I think one of the difficulties about either the era we're living in, or really just our species, and this has been the case for a long time, although, is that, and I know this is something you feel strongly about, John, that science has developed as a tremendously important way of human brain mind thinking and sorting out truth from falsity, if you will, or things that will get you to the moon versus things that will cause a crash. So what I would say is that the people who believe things that are either unfalsifiable if they're benign or whatever, or things that it becomes a problem when they're dangerous, and that usually is when people have absolutist beliefs that not only do I believe X, but my X is right, and uh, you are either a sinner, or you are uh, worthy of being killed if you don't believe X. And that's the biggest danger, right? Is when people are absolutist about their beliefs, and those beliefs then are not tolerant. And so, I would argue for, although again, people can say, oh, this is just your cultural belief or whatever, but sort of at a post Enlightenment, as I know you would, a sort of scientific, humanistic approach. And because you could also say, even in different societies or different political cultures, the individual freedom, quote unquote, is important. Or people can say, oh, that's not a universal value. That's just your culture, and my political system and value doesn't care about that. And so, again, I don't want to get into politics. I don't want to get into
No,
religion, but I will say that, in terms of fundamentals of morality and ethics, and objective truth or not, it is a very worthwhile debate to think about what can be said or not, and at least on the group level and on the species level, what it constitutes a danger to our existence,
that's
or
exactly
or
right.
not. And yeah.
You're taking this in the direction I'd love to go, and I think what you're finding with quote artificial intelligence, large language models, making knowledge explicit, is explicit is the ability to actually test out certain beliefs. But what I'm getting at is that some of the things that I made this point to me earlier is that you have these belief systems that can be explicit and empirically tested, and suddenly they become tangible. And this is where I'm really intrigued. And I think that you start to have a basis for making certain judgments, assessments as to the ethics, the morality, the viability of certain things. And this is where this idea of intelligence and life, to me, are tied together, is that keeping things alive and what it is to be alive under certain conditions of complexity then select for certain types of beliefs and become a criteria for certain kinds of beliefs, and that you can start to make those assessments. So and I think we've talked about this.
Although, if I can say, there may
Sure.
be cases in which false beliefs can still be adaptive, right?
Well, that's what I'm getting. I
That
mean,
the belief
it,
state per se, and so there's the distinction between even adaptive and true or not. And then the other issue, which is very important uh, in the context of what we're talking about, is the way in which people can manipulate other people's beliefs, or even now use AI and other things, and politics and advertising and bots and disinformation and psychological principles to manipulate other people's beliefs and even behavior in a way that is highly disturbing and dangerous, and that has only increased with the technology right now.
but so we had an earlier conversation as to what I so you have so we understand physiological opiates. We understand what those are and the addictions that we can create. So and we have so the Sackler the whole example the Sackler example. But now we're now looking at addictive algorithms is and that we have a do we have a criteria, a medical criteria for saying that is the same thing? Those are equivalent. That is an addiction, and that is a pathology, and it's not just an expression of some opinion or something. It has this signature to it, and therefore we can make it, we can actually say that this has a legal consequence to it. This is an actionable legal that once we can start to make those determinations, then that's a pretty powerful transition in how we look at communication, quotes free speech, and the organization of a civil society.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are certain sensory stimuli and prompts and cues and so forth that are addictive, and they don't have to be just drug. They can be behavioral for sure, including computer and internet related and so forth. And there is a neurobiology and a way in which the brain reward system in a region called the ventral striatum, and with dopamine projections from deeper regions of a certain sort, and its interconnections, mediates this sort of reinforcement learning, which can even be outside of a person's, quote, volitional control. And that state can be understood, characterized, quantified, captured in the brain. And then still one can distinguish between the content of it versus the thing itself, but it can be these processes. The content can be exchanged for other things or induced for sure.
So I mean this. So what you just described then is we move into a more complex, global, interdependent society with all this messaging. I mean, you're starting. We need to have criteria for sorting these things out. And I think that for the health of the community, and I think you're alluding to there are criteria, medical criteria. I mean, you can there may be signatures in the brain that you can say this is a result of this is an addictive signature. This is a result of being exposed to this kind of information. Would that be possible?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, it could be a slippery slope and a dangerous one, and especially since we want to still make room for, and not in an authoritarian way or a legal way or even in terms of judgments, categorize or label certain things in certain ways, and still account for a pretty wide spectrum of things. But when it comes to a question of what's truth or not, even with a Rashomon and multiple perspectives sort of thing, or for certain kinds of questions, there are tractable approaches that can lead to answers that are either correct or incorrect, and the notion that everybody can have their own truth, that may be true in a metaphorical sense in terms of people's right to believe or to this or that, but if and we absolutely want to be respectful of mental freedom, but not all the truth value, if you will, at least among the subset of things about which one can claim or ascertain such. is not just willy-nilly up for grabs. There are criteria by which things can be judged, and I know that you're very interested too, as I am, in thinking about how AI and other developments may be able to not only help with that, but in fact, equally important, avoid the harm that comes from some of the more dangerous or concerning permutations of that.
So just to that point, and as build on, because one of the things we're thinking a lot about, and there's a major conversation, is AI and governance. And so there's notion of governance. With, when they say governments, you think government, and then you think regulations, and then you think external controls. So it'd be a company, you could have a board of directors, you have regulators, you have laws. And I would argue that given the nature of this next generation of AI is happening so fast, that you have agents and LLMs that can generate material 1,000, 100,000 times faster than people. That we're getting in a different world. That you're going to have to build innately some kind of homeostatic governance mechanism that is embodied in the definition of the agent itself, so that it is by its very nature it cannot do something, and you may be able to insert a kind of agency or independent conscience that looks at it, and reports it out and says, "So and I can explain what it's doing, and it is going off the rails, and here's the way it's going off the rails. There's a potential, and it reports on itself, or this other agent embodied in it is independent reports on it. So we can start to design things that actually enforce a certain kind of set of values, preserving life, bringing truth, that we can also see the evolutionary or adaptive value of those things as well. And my own view is that the increasing of life, the increasing of complexity, is a positive natural good of what it means to be alive. And so keeping the planet alive, keeping ourselves alive, that I'm biased. I think that's a good idea. So,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
on that predicate, right?
yeah. So agree. And you and I have spoken a lot about this, and I think one of the areas of exciting work that we're doing together is thinking about how to meld the neuroscience
Right.
of really the neurobiology of moral decision making and morality. And again, you could say, well, morals are relative or this or that, but in terms of certain core ethical principles, and again, one can eschew them or people can not want them, but if one thinks about the planet, as you say, and our even our species and our societies, our world, I think we really, really need to address this. And we're understanding more and more about the human brain and how pro-social as well as antisocial capacities
That's right.
evolved, and how moral reasoning and behavior evolved for adaptive reasons. But that doesn't mean that everybody always acts that way, even within a person, and certainly within a population. You have one of the big concerns I have in all regards is bad actors or authoritarian regimes who then can take technologies and accelerate and scale their ill effects, their destructive effects on people in the world and societies. But basically, what I think we can do and really need to do is inform the development of AI by and first of all increase our experimentation into how humans have solved it, and that doesn't mean it's the only way or the best way, and it has downsides, etc. But inform the development of AI with with what we're learning about the principles of the evolution of human moral reasoning and how people can act in a more selfless way and in a more compassionate way. Again, I would distinguish between the pro-social and antisocial sorts of processes and neural underpinnings that we have within our brain, and we need them both in terms of individual survival and group survival. But they don't always work ideally within an individual or within a group. And if I could say one last thing, and would love to hear what you say. The other related thing is that this gets into something that I'm very concerned with and looking at a lot now, which is the whole group the whole in-group versus out-group, us
Yes.
versus them, and the neural underpinnings and evolutionary underpinnings of that in the brain, and that can even affect moral decision making. And there are functional MRI experiments that have shown that you can arrive even at a different, I would say, pseudo moral
Yes. Right.
feeling, or and it's important to say feeling as well as cognition,
Right.
or versus cognition, that that such that for the same scenario, you may blame a different person or agent based upon whether they're in the quote in group or out group, and the quote in group or out group can even change and be manipulatable in an experimental or sociological or cultural way. And we need to realize, in as Homo sapiens, we're all the in group.
Okay.
That if we're invaded by Mars, that we and our quote enemies all of a sudden become the same team. And so we want to try to promote that, although there would be people who argue against that. At least that's my
Well, no,
thought.
to very much agree with you and take on that point. I think the idea of recognizing our interdependence in this whole idea of saying, well, you have absolute freedom and rights, and it's all about the individual and all that. But I also think that people may be we may have some evolutionary hardwiring or predilection to certain kinds of responses, and that may be vary by personality type. So you have a reflex that was very good in a small group under certain conditions that they were selected for, and now we're living in a totally highly complex, changing, interdependent society. So what seems to be common sense and be natural and has worked in the past just doesn't work anymore. And you really and you're dealing with a rich set of complexity. So the in-group out thing highlights that because you're suddenly exposed to many more people. Who's in my group? Who's outside my group? Who's friend? Who's foe? All that kind of thing. These categories become extremely important. And if revert to our older reflexes, and if you look at young men, I mean, they don't their executive functions have not been mature until they're in their 20s, right? And so they're selected for to being able to throw themselves unwilling, into conflict. That's not good at certain levels of complexity, and I think we sort of need to admit that maybe some of these initial wiring conditions are not optimal for the world we live. Would you concur with that? Or
You're bringing up really important points, John, and it gets to the issue of evolution, even the issue of cultural evolution or not, and the way in which ideas and behaviors are, the effects thereof, the context, how that can change, and the fact that evolutionary time and processes may not be fast enough to, given the change in human type of life and situation and societies over the past couple of hundred years, and it's accelerating. And almost coming back to an earlier thing that you alluded to, whether we may, if it's not fast enough, whether we can, and again, it gets into both science fiction and you don't want it to be dystopian, whether computers and AI can help us in this regard, help in the same way that I was arguing a few minutes ago about the informing AI by the human brain, and so forth, in its best senses of what's evolved from the human brain, in terms of morality and so forth. We can have AI act as a check back on to the human brain in its worst senses, both individually and as a population. But again, what one person might do with that or misdo with that, if you will, or misuse nefariously, I think these are huge, huge issues. But certainly, and even coming back to another thread of our conversation, people can now, impute feelings or have feelings towards an AI agent, and so forth. And it gets into the whole issue of trust, relationships, on and on. And this is going to happen. It's unfolding by the week, as we know. And some people are going to use it for ill. We're going to try to use it for good. and then the issue is how you can think about that.
Can I? It strikes me that there may be some kind of universally agreed to principles on norms, and that is that you mentioned one is being absolutism. To me, once you go absolute, then that's it's a sign of disease. Other one is a closed-in system. That suddenly people want to fix something and close it, and that can be called traditional religion. That's idolatry. It's like, but if you look at any kind of complex system, you can't have a closed system. It doesn't work at some point. I mean, it just doesn't work. And so when there is a claim to make a closed system and absolutize that, that is a clear pathology, I would argue. And you could just say that and not without
Yeah, and
concern.
this gets to something that that we've been talking about and that I've been sort of floating and or at least interrogating, which is whether we can consider certain things on the population level, whether there's such a thing as population psychopathology. And
Yes,
by that, I don't mean the epidemiologic incidence of schizophrenia or PTSD
that's
on the
exactly right.
population level. I mean certain behaviors and or um, beliefs and or emotions that are toxic, that are, if you define based upon human mental disorders, things that cause suffering and or dysfunction. But again, one has to be very careful not to either pathologize unnecessarily or medicalize, or to be
Yes,
culturally bound and not humble, because what we think or somebody else might think, falls within that, might be the exact opposite of one somebody else thinks, and so forth. But all of that said, I would still say that as a species, and looking objectively and scientifically and humanistically, and people may issue science and humanistic thought, and of course a lot of people do, but at least from that vantage point, that there are certain things that one may be able to characterize on the population level as at least unhealthy in the metaphorical sense, or deleterious. And in fact, people have used other words for that in sociology, maybe, and
right.
this or that, possibly political science, and anthropology is a different story. But the way in which we think about that, I think we ought to think about that. I guess is what I'm saying. And
And do
and
you think you can
uh,
thread that needle? Do you think you can thread that needle that you can actually make it? I mean,
I hope. Yeah, I don't know. That's the hypothesis that I'm currently testing.
so how do we test
And
that? How do we test that hypothesis?
well, and there's testing it sort of empirically about whether certain things have explanatory power or validity in the way that they can be measured, or and so forth. But then there's also the sense in which, will it work? Will it be helpful? And or will it be deleterious? And so forth. And so I have a lot of trepidation, but I think what's important maybe is to even stay away from certain labels. Even though I think the notion of talking about pathology on the systems level of human society, the bunch of Homo sapien brains interacting, let alone Homo sapien brains now interacting with AI agents and other things, so that you have a system of systems. We're going to have to model that complex system and for pathology or benefits. But to the extent of pathology, the notion might be: are there certain things that are harmful for people? Although people might say they don't care, or that if it's harmful for some and not others. But again, or how do you measure that, or define that, or care about that? But if certain things are harmful or deleterious, and at least as a doctor, I come back to, well, if there's something hurtful or causes suffering, can we do something about it? Can, by
Right.
diagnosing it more precisely, can we develop, if not a cure, or treatment, an intervention that we can test empirically, that to see if it's helpful or not, or what the risk benefit is, or side effects or not, if you will. And so that's the sort of approach that I might advocate.
That's great. Well, I mean, we're approaching the end of our time. David, you have something else you want to say that we haven't covered that would be
This has been a very stimulating conversation as always, John.
Well, thank you very much, David, very much. It was a great honor and pleasure to have this conversation with you. And I hope we have many, many more and we're able to address these issues. So,
Likewise, as always, John, and it's a pleasure to work with you on them.
okay, take care, friend. All right.
Bye bye.
Bye.